In Chapter 3, we're going to study the difference between culture and society and what makes up our culture. So let's define culture. Culture is the totality of things that you've learned, such as customs, knowledge, beliefs, ideas, behaviors, those things that are learned that identify a group of people. Now, it consists of values that a group holds, norms that they follow. Remember, norms are the rules of do's and don'ts, material goods that they create, and the language and symbols that they use to communicate. Culture is a way of life for a group, so how they dress, their marriage customs, family life, maybe even how families are organized, workforce, religion, all of these things make up a culture. Now, when we look at culture, there are two types of culture. There's material culture and non-material culture. Now, material cultures are those physical items that you can see, touch, hold, smell. So material cultures are things such as cars and houses and jewelry and clothes and buildings and artwork and those things. Non-material culture are non-physical, so they're abstract. There are thoughts, our ideas, our beliefs, things that we cannot see, but we hold to be true, acceptable, good, and valued. Now, when we're looking at society, society is different than culture. However, people tend to think that the words mean the same thing, but they do not. So culture is kind of like the big umbrella. And then there are societies that are underneath the culture. So society is a large number of people living in basically the same territory or area and are relatively independent of people outside of their area. However, they all participate in a common culture. So a society is the largest form of a human group that we have, and they all share some common heritages and culture. Now, an example for us is we are all, if you were born and raised here, or even if you moved here from another country and now you are an American citizen, then the culture that we live under is the American culture. So we have certain ideas and thoughts and traditions and things that represent what it is to be American. Now, under the American culture, we have different societies. So you can think on a kind of a micro scale. You can think of large geographical areas such as the Northeast would be a society, and the Southeast and the Southwest, and maybe the West Coast or the Midwest. Kind of break the country up into those geographical parts. That is a society. Each of them kind of have their own way of being and doing, yet they all share a common culture. Now you can also micro those down. So if you look at Southeast, you could micro it down to Atlanta or down even to Barnesville, Georgia. Or you might compare that to a different society, which would be LA or New York City. So those two words are not interchangeable. Now, every culture has what is known as cultural universals. Now, cultural universals are practices and beliefs that are found in most, if not all, cultures around the world, but how they are practiced varies from culture to culture. Now, we had an anthropologist named George Murdoch who actually listed common cultural universals that he found in the majority of cultures around the world. Those are sports, cooking, dancing, visiting, personal names, marriage, medicine, religious rituals, funeral ceremonies, sexual restriction, and trade. So about every culture around the world are going to have these universals within them, but again, how they are viewed and how they are practiced will differ from culture to culture. For example, if we look at marriage in the United States, the individual chooses who they will marry. They choose at what age they will marry. They will choose how they will marry. But in another culture, it may be arranged marriages in which the individuals that are actually getting married have no say in who they marry, at what age, where they'll live. That is all actually arranged for them by someone else. Another example of this would be funeral ceremonies. If you think about what is a common funeral ceremony here in our culture, someone passes away and you might have a visitation and then you would have a funeral service. Okay, and in that funeral service, there might be some prayers or some songs being sung. People might tell some stories of the individual, that sort of thing. Okay, but in a country, different culture, funeral services and funeral ceremonies are quite different. There's actually a group in Papua New Guinea who worships the crocodile. And so when an individual dies, they actually feed the body to the crocodile. And they think that that is a great honor to be descended back into with the crocodile. So again, know all of Murdoch's cultural universals and what universals are. Now, when we look at culture, I want to look at two terms called ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Ethnocentrism is the idea that one assumes that their own culture and way of life represents the norm and/or is superior to all others. Now, there is a difference between ethnocentrism and patriotism. In today's society, there's this push from the left, if we're looking political, that being a proud patriot is a bad thing. Being proud of your country is a bad thing, but it's not. Patriotism just is love of your country, love of who you are, and you don't deny that there's issues and you don't deny that we could improve, but you love who you are. Ethnocentrism is this idea that your way of doing things is the right way and the only way, and anyone else who does something different is wrong. Now, in ethnocentrism, a person or group of people may see their way of doing things as maybe the defining point and is normal. So everyone can be ethnocentric. We all have been ethnocentric. Imagine a time in which you experience culture shock, or you've seen something where someone else is doing something that is quite opposite of what you do, and you kind of react to it initially like, ooh, eek, yuck, you know, or that's bad. Okay, that's kind of being ethnocentric without even knowing it, because you are judging the other way of being as wrong based upon how you believe. Now, with cultural relativism, this is where you want to get to. You want to recognize that you can be ethnocentric, but what you want to get to is cultural relativism. And this refers to the viewing of people's behavior from the perspective of those people's culture. So you're trying to learn why they believe the way they do and why they do the things they do, coming from their perspective. Now, just because you learn from their perspective doesn't mean that you have to accept or agree with what they do. The object here is to just learn why, coming from their viewpoint. So you're removing your thoughts and your beliefs and your ideas out of the picture, and you're learning from theirs. Okay? Now, when you do this, you learn to no longer be biased, or no longer are biased. You learn to not be biased. Okay? So, culture, society, two different things. Learn what the cultural universals are, and then learn the difference between ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. In sociology, we have a term called social status. Now, you have heard the word status before, and in it, a status is somebody's ranking or position in a hierarchy. And in a way, that is true when it comes to sociological statuses, but the definition of a social status in sociology is a defined social position or ranking a place within society. So when I say, what is your status? I am asking, what is your social position that you hold, and or where is the ranking of that position within society? Now there are three types of statuses: ascribed status, achieved status, and master status. An ascribed status is a type of status that is given automatically, so you don't select it or choose it. It is placed upon you due to certain criterias given by society. So an ascribed status is when you are born, you are automatically given the status of a child. If you are the oldest sibling, when your younger sibling was born, you are automatically given the ascribed status of sibling or brother or sister. Our age is another ascribed status. If one of your siblings gets married, you automatically become an in-law, a sister-in-law, or a brother-in-law. So as you can see, in ascribed status, you have no say in it. It is given to you automatically. Now, achieved status is a type of status in which you choose. So it is not placed upon you unless you choose it to be so. So this is a status you intentionally obtain. So an achieved status could be high school graduate, college graduate, mother, father, wife, husband. I'm a professor, that's an achieved status. You're a student, that's an achieved status. So an achieved status is one you choose. Now a master status is the status that most defines who you are in a given time. So for example, if you had to say, I am a blank, and you had to list your statuses 1 through 5, with 1 being the most important to you at that time, or the one that most defines who you are, that is going to be your master status. Now, your master status could stay the same throughout your lifetime. That's up to you. Or for most people, their master status tends to change depending on the stage in life that they're in. So for example, if you are a traditional college graduate or college student right now, and you graduated high school and you went straight into college, then your master status might be college student. That's what defines you the most right now. However, there are many of you who are married and hold full-time jobs and have a family, and you're going to school. So the status of college student may not be your master status. For example, my master status is that of mother. So that is the one status that defines ultimately who I am. It guides who I am. So what I'd like for you to do at this point is write down at least 5 social statuses that you hold. Okay, we all hold more than 5, but I want you to put down at least 5 social statuses, 5 social positions that you hold. So think about these titles or these labels or these balls in the air that you have. I am a blank. Fill that in. With each 5 of them, then write next to it if it is an ascribed status, an achieved status, or is it your master status. Now, going along with every social status, we have social roles. Now, do not confuse the term roles with kind of like a part that you're playing. Social roles are patterns or expected behaviors of any given status or position. So social roles are expected behaviors that are placed upon you because you hold a specific social status. Okay? Now you may not do all these expected behaviors, but society is still going to place the expectation on you just because you hold that status. Now, when it comes to social roles, we have times in which these roles might butt heads together. Let's look at the term role strain. The role strain is the roles of one status that interfere with each other or become overwhelming at times. So in a role strain, you have one status, And then the roles, the expected behaviors of that status are button heads. For example, you are a college student. That is one status. So some expected roles of you are to come to class every time, don't be late, do your homework, study for tests, write your papers. So what happens when you need to be in class at a specific time, but you need time to write a paper for another class, and the only time you can do that is really during class time? So see, you have one status, student, and two roles. You have to attend class and you need to write that paper, kind of interfering with each other. Now the second type is role conflict. And in order to have a conflict, you need two or more things. So a role conflict is when the roles of two or more statuses conflict with each other. So, for example, let's say you're a student and you work. There are two statuses right there, student and employee. So you need to go to class. However, your boss is saying you need to come into work at the same time. So now you have the roles of two different statuses conflicting with each other. So now what I want you to do is look at that list of statuses that you just wrote, those 5, and I want you to write down an example of role strain and role conflict. As we learned in the beginning of this chapter, we learned what culture is. Remember, culture is the totality of things learned that compose or make up a group of people. So your ideas, your thoughts, your traditions, your customs. But I want to look at the elements that are found in every culture. Now, all cultures around the world will have elements of language and symbols, norms, values, and beliefs. Now again, what is believed about these and how they are practiced will differ from culture to culture, but you will find each of these in a culture. So let's look at language. Now language is a foundation of every culture. Language may be thought of as an abstract system of word meanings or symbols. It can include speech, written characters, numbers, symbols, nonverbal gestures, expressions, or even sounds. So there is no culture in the world without some sort of language system. Now languages are mostly written and spoken. So when we look at that, our language we use can shape how we view things around us. Okay, so the language we use can shape what we see, how we see it, what we hear, how we interpret what we hear, how we feel, even how we smell or taste something. So what I want to look at is a concept called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now this hypothesis suggests that the language, the words, the symbols, and the meanings attached to them will construct our reality. So for example, the words we use with the meanings attached to those words to describe something will then create a picture or an idea in our head about that thing, which then creates what we think is our reality about that. So for example, I want you to get a picture in your head when I say the following words. What would you think of a person whom I say is unemployed? Now think about what society attaches to even all the negative stereotypes of someone who is unemployed. And you know nothing else about this person other than they're unemployed. And you're attaching what that means to it. You now have just created what you think is your reality about that person. So you've now created a specific image, thought, and feelings attached to that person. Now, what if I, instead of saying unemployed, said this person is just between jobs? Now the term between jobs means something else and creates a different picture and a different thought process. How about if I said someone was promiscuous? And instead of saying promiscuous, what if I just said they have a healthy sex life? What if I was to say that someone was stupid? What image would you have of them if that was the only thing you knew about them? Now what if I was to use the word uneducated? So Sapir-Whorf is saying that the words we use to describe something has a direct link to what we think about that thing. Now, for example, Brussels sprouts. There are some people who absolutely love Brussels sprouts. And so Brussels sprouts, they're going to use the word delicious and healthy, and that's going to create how they taste them, what they think about them, and how they accept them. But for some of us, like myself, I'm going to use the words yucky and horrible and disgusting. So see, I've already created a reality about Brussels sprouts just by the words I use. Now, what we've seen in society to come about to combat the negative words is this thing that you are all familiar with, which is political correctness. Now, political correctness started out as the concept of taking a negative word, which has negative connotations, and replacing it with a more positive word. And in hoping that when you use the positive word, then people change their thoughts about that thing, which then means they change their behavior towards it. However, what has happened is political correctness has gone way too far and it's circled back around. It's kind of biting us in our own behinds now. So now what we've done is created a society where they're offended by everything, and so we can't say anything without somebody getting upset. So political correctness kind of didn't work there. Now, language also consists of nonverbal communication. So nonverbal communication can be gestures, facial expressions, and other learned visual signs. So now let's look up norms. Now, you remember, we studied norms, and norms are established standards of behavior maintained by society. So norms are really our rules of behaviors, our do's and don'ts of behavior. So all societies have a list of behaviors that is acceptable, good, and right. And then they have a list of behaviors that is unacceptable, wrong, and bad. And so these norms are these rules. Now there are two types of norms, formal norms and informal norms. I'm sorry, there are actually four types of norms. Formal norms and informal norms, mores, and folkways. Formal norms are norms that are generally written down and specify strict punishment for violation. So these could include laws, regulations, student handbooks, employee handbook, my syllabus. Okay? Informal norms are not necessarily written down, but they are generally understood. So an informal social norm would be when it's cold outside, you don't wear shorts and flip-flops. Nowhere is that really written down formally, but it's clearly understood that when it's cold, you're supposed to wear warmer clothes. Mores are norms that are deemed highly necessary to the welfare of society. So these are the behaviors that we put high moral significance on. So usually if someone breaks a more, it has such a stigma attached to it that that person will never be able to get rid of it. So some examples of mores are murder, treason, child abuse, molestation, rape. And the last type of norm is a folkway. Now, folkways are norms that govern our everyday behavior. So think of the rules of etiquette and your manners. These are rules for casual interactions such as saying please and thank you and bless you when someone sneezes, or not wearing your hat indoors, or opening the door for someone. Now, when we look at norms, we also have our values. Now, values are collected concepts of what is considered good, desirable, and proper. So we put upon some element or every element of society and say this is good, desirable, or good or acceptable, or it is bad, not desired, and unacceptable. And then we use these values to guide our behavior within society. Now, when we look at the elements of culture, we're going to have to look at social control and sanctions. So click on that megaphone now to listen to that. When we look at norms, especially in a culture, we must know social control and sanctions. Now, social control is a way to encourage people to follow the social norms. So they are the techniques or strategies we use to deter people from being deviant, to deter people from breaking the norms. So for example, let's just say your parents give you a curfew, and then they say if you're late, you will be grounded. The grounding is the social control technique that is being used to encourage you to be home in time. Okay, example being a student. If you don't study well and you take your test or do your homework and you get a failing grade, that failing grade is the social control element that is encouraging you to follow the norm, which is you need to study and do well in school. Now, with every social control, there are sanctions. Okay, sanctions can either be penalties or rewards for either following norms or breaking the norms. So, for example, if you are an employee and you do an exceptionally good job, then you'll get a raise. That raise is a formal reward sanction for following the norm. But let's say you're repeatedly late for work, so you get fired. Being fired is the penalty sanction for breaking the norm. The norm is you're supposed to be to work on time. Okay, again, grounding would be a penalty for being late. So for every behavior, every norm, there is a social control technique or element used, and then there is a sanction that is placed upon every behavior depending on whether we follow the norm or if we violate the norm. Let's look at these four terms when it comes to types of culture. You have high culture. These are cultural ways and expectations of those within who we think are high society or in the higher class. So it is behaviors or things that we attach to the upper level, such as expensive homes, expensive cars, big fancy vacations. They go to the opera, they eat at fancy restaurants, they may be active in politics. Now, popular culture, on the other hand, makes up the majority of the population of a culture. So while a high culture may be a small group, a popular culture is a large group, and it is something that the majority of the people participate in. For example, the majority of people in the United States will wear jeans or tennis shoes and t-shirts, while in the high culture, they may wear more expensive suits and dresses and the big labels. Now, the next two terms I want you to know are subcultures and countercultures. Now, a subculture is a segment of society that shares a distinctive pattern of beliefs, values, and behaviors that differs from the pattern of the larger society. Okay? So really, these members of a subculture belong to this group because they have something in common, and it sets them apart from other people who don't have that thing in common, yet it all falls under the main culture. So for example, we all have multiple subcultures, okay? Think of all the different groups that you belong to, not a category. Now, a category is having brown hair, being short or tall or right-handed or left-handed. That's a category. We're not talking about that. We're talking about groups that you belong to, that all members of that group have something in common. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be a group that you physically get together in. It is just a group that there is something that allows you to be a member of it. Now, I'll give you some examples of my subculture. I'm a wife. I'm a college professor. That sets me apart different from high school teacher or an elementary teacher. Let me see. I'm a libertarian, conservative libertarian at that. I'm a Baptist. That's my religion, my denomination. I'm a mother of an only child. I'm an avid reader. And I love to watch movies. Those are all the groups that I belong to. I belong to a lot more, but those are the subcultures that I belong to that set me apart. But all the members of that group have that one thing in common. Now, a counterculture, on the other hand, though, is a subculture, but it is a type of subculture that deliberately opposes certain aspects of the larger culture. So, for example, the hippies in the 60s and the 70s would have been a counterculture. A terrorist group today is a counterculture. These members really don't necessarily fit into mainstream society, but they purposely choose not to. So it could be the people that are living off the grid today. Most of us probably don't belong to a counterculture. You might. Nudist would be a counterculture. So if I've got any closeted nudists out there, well, you're in a counterculture because our culture says we need to have clothes on. So what I'd like for you to do right now is I would like for you to write down at least 5 subcultures that you belong to. Keep in mind, you are a member of more than 5, but let's just think of 5, and I'll give you one that you all share right now, and that is college student. You need to think of culture as this evolving, growing, changing thing because culture is always changing. Society is always changing. It may not always be changing on a grand scale. It could be hundreds of millions of tiny little changes, but it's evolving. Now, there are new items or new things that are added to material culture. Remember, material culture are those physical things that we can see, touch, feel, smell. And at any given time, all of these new things are added to the material culture, which then also will change our non-material culture. Now there is a culture lag between the two because the material culture changes much, much faster than the non-material. So our physical things change constantly and quickly, while our non-physical things, our ideas, our beliefs, our values change more slowly. But how do cultures change? Cultures change in one of 2 ways, either by innovation or by diffusion. So let's look at those. Innovation refers to the process of introducing new ideas or objects to a culture. Now there are 2 ways that innovation happens: discovery and inventions. Now the process of discovery involves making known or sharing the existence of an aspect of reality. So discovery means that there is something that's always been there, we just didn't know it, and then we discovered it. When we discover something new, then of course we use it in a way that benefits or is added to the culture. The second way of innovation is inventions. Now, inventions are when items are combined to create something that did not exist before. So again, 2 ways of innovation is discovery, which is discovering something that's always been there and we never knew it, or invention, by inventing something that never existed before. Now, when we look at diffusion, we have to connect in with diffusion globalization. Okay, now globalization is the worldwide integration of government policies, cultures, social movements, financial markets, etc. So globalization is basically this invisible network, if you want to think of it, of connecting all the different countries together in some form or another: politics, business, whatever it may be, religion, that sort of thing. Now, under globalization, we have what is a process called diffusion, and cultures will change because they diffuse together. So diffusion refers to the process by which a cultural item spreads from one group to another group, or from one society to another society. Okay? In this spreading of cultural ideas or norms or cultural items can occur through different ways. It could occur from one person from one culture going to another and exploring it, or through mission work, or for tourism. It's just one group or one person from another going to another culture, and with it taking their ways of being, ideas, and things. And then the culture that they're visiting then starts to absorb that into their culture. Now, technology also helps with this, of course, with the internet and all of the aspects that come with it. So we can use that now to start influencing one culture in another. Now, when we look at diffusion, you are honestly going to have multiple ways, groups that will come out of diffusion. So we're going to talk about that eventually in the semester, when one group comes in contact with another group and then they form a completely new group together, or the two groups together stay independent. How diffusion changes the new culture differs and varies depending on what it is. But for now, I want you to be able to answer, how do cultures change? And that is through innovation and diffusion. Let's begin to look at the different types of societies that have developed since mankind. And keep in mind that each of these types of societies that we're going to discuss still exist in the world today. So just as a reminder, a society differs from culture. Society refers to a group of people who live within a kind of territory or a defined community, and they all share the same culture. There are three categories of society, which is pre-industrial societies, industrial societies, and post-industrial societies. So let's look at pre-industrial societies. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, which happened in the 1600s, and before the use of machinery, societies were very small, rural, and dependent largely on local resources. Economic production was limited. They didn't really grow anything. They didn't really make anything. Everything was very small in the beginning. Now, the very first type of group of societies was your hunting and gatherers, and this is the basic structure of human society up until about 10,000, 12,000 years ago. So while 10,000 and 12,000 years seems like a lot, it really isn't in the grand scheme of human time here. So these groups were basically structured around what we know as kinship, or a tribal type system. Hunting and gatherers relied on their surroundings for survival. So they hunted wild animals and they foraged or picked uncultivated plants for food. Now, uncultivated means they did not grow it. So basically, to survive, they would hunt animals and they would pick food, plants, berries, whatnot, that naturally grew in their surrounding areas. When these resources became scarce, then the group would move, which means that they were called nomadic. So they would move from one place to the other based on the food source. Now, right around 7,000 years ago or so, society started changing, and changing conditions led to some societies to domesticate animals. And that means that they began to recognize their ability to tame and breed animals and to grow and cultivate their own plants. So about 7,000 years ago, humans discovered that, hey, we could actually breed these animals, raise these animals up for resources and for food, and we could also start planting and cultivating crops. Now, pastoral groups were able to breed livestock and use it for different resources such as food. If it's an animal that gave milk, they could use the milk. They could shear the fur or the coat and use it to make food, clothing. Animals could also be used as a form of transportation, such as larger animals that could pull wagons or trailers or something. And then also in the pastoral society, since they could now grow their own crops and have large herds, they would have what is known as a surplus of goods. Before, hunting and gatherers only killed and picked exactly what they needed to eat for that day. They never stored food up because food would go bad if they did that. Now here in the pastoral society, they're starting to have storages. Okay, now herding and pastoral societies remain nomadic though, because they needed to follow the food source for the animals. So the animals were the primary thing here in pastoral. Pastoral means herding, okay? And so when the food source for whatever animals they're growing was starting to get scarce, then they would move to a new place in order to have food for their animals. Now, horticulture, if we look at when pastoral societies would move when there's a depletion of the region's crop, horticultural societies formed in areas where there was plenty of water, whether it be rainfall or a source from a river or a stream, but mainly rainfall. Horticultural societies, because there was plenty of rainfall and other conditions, it allowed them to grow more crops. Okay? And since they didn't have to abandon their location to follow the resources, here in human history is when we started to see the development of permanent settlements. This is where we started to see first villages that would be created, and they stayed. They no longer moved from place to place. And then, of course, those villages would move into become bigger towns, and then in some places, bigger cities, etc. Now, right around 3000 BC, your book calls it BCE, before Common Era, we had an explosion of machinery and technology and the agricultural revolution. Okay, now before the agricultural revolution, pastorals and horticultural societies used small temporary tools that were called digging sticks. Okay, so any tool that the pastoral and horticultural society used, it was temporary, one that they could basically leave if it couldn't be easily carried from one place to the other. Now in the agricultural revolution though, here is where large-scale farming happened. Okay, so farmers learned that they could rotate the types of crops grown in their fields. They could reuse waste products. They learned what crops grew best, how to rotate from one field to the other. So in the agricultural revolution, about 3000 BCE, is when large-scale farming came on. Now, because resources were plentiful here, it now started to create a divide between the wealth of the people within that community. Okay, so some people who would have larger amounts of wealth would, or had more resources, could afford better living conditions, afford more stuff. And so here's where we start to see what we know as classes developed. Now, the last pre-industrial society is the feudal society, and that's the 9th century, gave rise to the feudal society. In history, in high school and in college, you may also have heard of this as the feudal estate societies or the estate societies, but we call them feudal societies. These societies contained a strict hierarchy system of power based on who owned what amount of land. So land ownership was the primary resource during the feudal system. The nobility, often known as lords, would own all the land. They would then place vassals, which were almost like soldiers, in charge of pieces of land, and in return for the resources that that land provided, the vassals would promise to fight for the lords. Okay? Now, the individual pieces of land were called fiefdoms. Okay? And they were cultivated or worked by the lower class, which were often called the serfs. Okay? In return for maintaining the land, these peasants or serfs were guaranteed a place to live and protection from outside enemies. So in the feudal system, again, now we start to see the very poor and the very wealthy. And for those that were wealthy, power was passed down through the family lines, okay? And then a lot of times the peasants or the serfs would work for generations of that same family over and over. So know that the first type of society is pre-industrial, and in those were hunting and gatherers, pastorals, horticultural, agricultural, and feudal. Right along in the 18th century, which is about the 1700s, late 1600s, early 1700s, Europe experienced a burst of technological inventions. Okay, and this ushered in what is called the Industrial Revolution. So prior to this, people lived just as we described. In the feudal system, agricultural, horticultural, people lived simple. They basically grew and made what they needed, and then they would either sell or barter or exchange for other stuff with items that they had. But when the Industrial Revolution happened, all of a sudden we have a number of new inventions that were changing the way people were living. Instead of paying, let's back that up. In 1782, James Watt and Matthew Boulton created a steam engine that then could do the work of horses and oxen and all of that. So with this invention of the steam engine, we now could create machinery that could do a lot more work in a short amount of time compared to that of human labor. Okay, so instead of paying a person to, let's say, raise the sheep, then shear the sheep, then spin the wool and weave it into clothes, which took months and months and months to do, people now created textile mills. And so then the production of clothing and other articles could be done faster and more efficiently. Okay, rather than planting and harvesting fields by hand, farmers now were able to use mechanical seeders or machines to do it. So therefore, they could produce a lot more, a lot faster. Products, everyday products were becoming more available to the average person, and quality and accessibility to education and to healthcare was now becoming widespread. Now, one of the results of the Industrial Revolution with the increased productivity was the rise of urban cities. Okay, now people would leave the farm now and move to these areas where these mills or factories were at so that they could get jobs there. This, believe it or not, these factory jobs were more stable than that of being a farmer or a hunter or that sort of thing. So with this large number of people coming in and now conjugating in one area, we start to see the rise of urban centers or cities. And then the population of the groups of people now started to get diverse because people from all different backgrounds and ethnicities were coming together to find work. Now, this new generation of workers in the city were now focused on creating wealth and achieving upward mobility and living a bit of a better life, and so they tended to let go of the traditional ways of being and thinking. So we also now have this non-material culture revolution. New ideas and thoughts and beliefs and ways of living were created and being created now, which changed from the way previous generations did things. We also have to know that life was changing quickly during this time, and when large masses of people move into one place, you're going to have problems. And with this were horrendous living conditions. And so you have a ton of people in here, and then think about all the filth and the overcrowding and the amount of poverty that was there. Everybody's gathering for the same resources. So some people are going to get those jobs and get those resources, and other people aren't. So here we have, in this burst of these new cities or larger centers, you're going to have a lot of health issues, diseases. So now what we have is a whole new issue of health conditions. It's during this time that social scientists, such as sociologists, were now being recognized, because then they were studying all the social problems that arise from this mass amount of people in one area. And also they studied the changing dynamics of family and kinship and social status. And so social scientists then became prominent during this time. The last type of society we're going to talk about is the post-industrial society, and this, of course, is the society that if you're a millennial or a Gen Z, know. Post-industrial society, also known as information society or the digital society, came about with the production of information and services. So the post-industrial society actually was created when the first computer software or the first computer processor was invented. So some of us are old enough to be alive before computers existed. As a matter of fact, I remember having and seeing my first desktop computer, which was an Apple computer, very, very archaic and ancient. And that was my sophomore year in high school. So I was not born in the post-industrial society, but many of you were. And because the post-industrial society today is an information society, power and wealth are driven not by knowledge or material goods, but lies in the creating, the storing, and distributing of information. So back in the industrial societies, you had in the United States the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, and they were the huge wealthy entrepreneurs. Now in the post-industrial society, the information societies, it's people such as Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, anyone who is in the cusp and controlling of information and services. And services is another thing that makes the post-industrial society. We are seller of services. We're no longer creators of goods and material goods, but of services. And so the people who have their hands on the ability to create, distribute, and sell information and knowledge and services are the ones that are going to rise within what is the post-industrial society that we have today. When we are studying society and social interaction, we must look at socialization. Now, socialization is the creation of developing who we are as a person. Now, socialization is the process in which people are taught to be proficient members of society. Now, one thing that you need to keep in mind is that socialization and socializing are not the same thing. Again, socialization is the process in which people are taught to be productive members of a society. Socialization is the way that we are taught from the time that we are born, how we're being taught certain ideas and manners and what is good, bad, right, wrong, acceptable, unacceptable. And so a lot of times though, students will think that socializing is socialization, and socializing is like the mixing or interacting with others. But keep in mind that socializing and socialization are not the same thing. So when we look at socialization, we have to look at the development of our self. Now, the definition of self is a distinct identity that sets each of us apart from others. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at a couple of theories of self-development, and in these theories you're going to see quite a bit, these four of psychology in them. This is the only time in this class we're actually going to cross the two together. And so let's take a look in the next PowerPoint, the sociological approaches to self. Let's begin looking at sociological approaches to developing our idea of who we are, of ourself. Let's first look at Charles Horton Cooley's Looking Glass Self. Now, Cooley states that the self is a product of our social interaction with other people. He says that there are three phases in the Looking Glass Self. The first phase is we imagine how we present ourselves to others. So we create this idea of who we are and we present that in a manner of our behavior, the way we talk, the way we dress, etc. We present that image of ourselves to other people. Now the second stage then is after we have presented ourselves to other people, we imagine how those people are evaluating us. Basically, we're imagining what they think about us. Okay? The third stage or phase then is based upon our interpretation of what we think they think of us. That's complicated, isn't it? Based on our interpretation of what we think they think of us, we then develop feelings about ourselves based off of that. So let me break this down real quickly. Again, the three phases are we imagine who we are and we present that to other people. Once we presented that to other people, we then imagine how they are evaluating us or what they're thinking about us. And then the third phase is based off of what we think they think. We then develop feelings about ourselves. So let me give you an example of this. We imagine that we are smart. Okay? And so then when we interact with people, we present ourselves in a manner in which we think will represent that we are smart or intelligent or, we have some kind of common sense going on. Once we've done that and we interact with someone, we take a step back and we start looking at how they are evaluating us. So based on their behavior and reactions towards us, we start then interpreting what we think they think of us. Okay, so let's just say that we present ourselves as being smart, and then we interact with people and we do that, and then they have this look on their face like, what are you talking about? Or you don't know what you're talking about. And based off of that look or interaction, we then think, uh-oh, they don't think I'm smart. And then the third phase is we then develop ideas about ourselves based off of that. So then all of a sudden I'm thinking, well, maybe I'm not smart. If they're acting like this, I thought I was smart. But based off of what I think they think of me, I'm not very smart. I hope that makes sense. Work it through in any type of scenario that you want and see if you can get these 3 phases down for Cooley. Now let's take a look at George Herbert Mead's idea of stages of self. And basically, Mead is saying that as we develop our idea or our concept of who we are, we actually move through 3 stages. The first stage is the preparatory stage. This is also known as the mimic stage. So this is very young children, toddlers on up to maybe 3 or 4, when children imitate the people around them. Now they'll imitate the behavior or the actions of people around them, but keep in mind in the preparatory stage, they really don't understand what they're doing or why they're doing it. They're just mimicking it. Then as we grow older, we enter into what is called the play stage. And this is when children start to pretend to be other people. So they're like actors becoming a character. So their role taking is the process of mentally assuming the perspective of other people and responding based upon that. So during the play stage, this is now where children begin to act like different characters. So it might be that they're playing cops and robbers, or they're pretending to be a teacher or a doctor or a mother. Whatever it is, they are becoming that character or that person. So here they're starting to mentally understand that certain people play certain roles, they do certain things, they act certain ways. So they're starting to connect that together. Now, the third stage is called the game stage, and this hits about maybe 10 or 11, and this is when children grasp their own social positions as well as everyone else's that's in the group. So this is where they learn to interact with people within the group based on who each person is in the group. So they're starting to understand that each individual person has a part or has a dynamic in the group. They're understanding what that is and then how they are to interact with it. So it could be a child understands the dynamics if they're interacting with their mother and their father. So if they want a certain thing, they will learn which parent to go to in order to get it. Now, in the game stage, you have what is called generalized others. Now, this refers to attitudes, viewpoints, or expectations of other people in society that you interact with and how that is taken into account with you and your behavior. So, for example, children behave differently with other children on the playground than they do if they are interacting with family at, let's say, Thanksgiving dinner. So they're starting to understand generalized others. Now, that is Mead's first theory, which is the stages of self. George Herbert Mead has a second theory of self, and that is what he calls, instead of stages of self, this is the theory of the self. This is where children picture themselves as the focus of everything around them. This is, as we mature, our self changes and we begin to understand that other people play and have a dynamic in what is going on. But at the very beginning, children only know themselves and everything is around them. So this is when you have toddlers and little Johnny and Charlie are playing, and Charlie has a truck and Johnny wants that truck. So Johnny just goes over and takes the truck from Charlie. Now Johnny is not being mean to Charlie whatsoever. Johnny just knows that Johnny wants that truck, and he has no concept of Charlie being within the situation or the dynamic, okay? He just wants the truck, so he goes and takes the truck. Now, as he grows, he will understand the dynamic of Charlie and this truck, and then as he gets older, he'll understand, well, Charlie has the truck right now, and Charlie's playing with that truck, and I'm going to have to either ask for the truck or wait till Charlie is done. That's when you get older. But small children do not understand the concept of other people in and around them and what happens. Now, Mead used the term significant others when it comes to this theory, which refers to individuals who are most important in the person's development. So in this theory of self, every small individual child has significant others, and those are the people who will predominantly influence their development, their socialization. This is known as significant others. Erving Goffman has a theory about developing of ourself, and it's called presentation of self. It is also known as dramaturgical analysis. So Goffman says that we present ourselves in a manner that certain impressions are given off. So impression management is acting a certain way to create a distinctive impression of who we are in the minds of others. So for example, when you go on a job interview, you're going to dress a certain way, you're going to carry yourself a certain way, you're going to speak a certain way in order to give off a specific impression to the person that you are being interviewed by. We do this all the time. Now, we do this in any given situation consciously and unconsciously. You will change your manner or how you act or how you dress or what you say to give off certain impressions based on where you're at, who you're with, and what impression you want them to have of you. Now, we also do this unconsciously. Now, have you ever watched a group of people and they're behaving a certain way, and then all of a sudden you notice someone or the group itself changes its behavior, even in the slightest way, and they may not have even been aware that they did it. And then you sit back and you go, I wonder what that was. So for example, let's just say that you have a group of guys hanging out together and you're watching them and they're acting in a certain way, typical guy behavior. And then maybe a pretty girl or a group of girls walk by, and whether they do it consciously or unconsciously, some of the group or the whole group or only one person of the group will change what they're doing. They'll change their behavior or how they're acting, or they'll do something to alter in order to give off an impression to a girl or the group of girls. So again, presentation itself is also known as dramaturgical analysis, and in it we use impression management, in which we act a certain way to create a distinctive impression upon other people. Let's look at the role of socialization and how we learn or are socialized in our life, how we develop our ideas, our thoughts, our beliefs. Now, all of us have learned the concept of nature versus nurture. You learn this in biology in middle school. If not middle school, at least you learned it in high school. And this is a debate that has evolved to a general acceptance that there is a interaction between our genetics, our heredity, environment, and socialization. And so there are a concept of how much of a person's personality, the development of self, is shaped by their culture and environment, or how much is shaped by their genetics and their DNA. So there are two sides to this. The nature side is going to be your biological, your genetics, your DNA. The nature side believes that we are who we are and how we are due to our genetics. The nurture side, which is going to be the social side or your environment, believes that we are who we are and how we are due to the culture we are raised in, the environment that we're raised in. Now, if we look at the two sides, if you are a psychology major, then you're naturally going to gravitate towards the nature side. Psychologists go towards the nature side, saying we are who we are, we act the way we do because that is our genetics, it's in our DNA. So they're going to say if a person is outspoken or shy or timid or very independent or dependent, they're going to say that that is because that's how our DNA has wired us. Now, sociologists are going to pick your nurture side. They're going to say that we learn who we are and we are how we are because of social influences outside that teaches us through our experiences and the things that we've learned. We then develop whether we're shy or outspoken or whether we're independent or dependent. Now, for the most part, social scientists pick one side or the other. If we have to pick one side or the other, then sociologists are going to pick the nurture side. That says that our environment, our social elements, outside forces teach us and develop who we are. However, keep in mind that sociologists do not ignore our genetics, our nature side. Sociologists do understand that our DNA, our genetics, play a part in who we are, but if we have to pick a stronger force, we're going to pick the nurture side. As sociologists, if we're going to pick the nurture side of socialization, those things outside forces that teach us who we are, then let's look at those aspects. We have what are known as agents of socialization. There are two groups of agents of socialization, and they are the social group agents and the institutional agents. So let's look. The two social group agents are family and peer groups. Okay? Now, our family is going to be the most important socialization agent to us in developing who we are, in learning our thoughts, our ideas, our beliefs, our values, our customs. Parents, tend to begin that by ministering to babies' needs by feeding them and cleaning them and comforting them. And then they guide the children as they grow into what is right, wrong, good, bad, acceptable, unacceptable. Now, as a child grows older, typically usually around middle school, family becomes somewhat less important in the social development, and peer groups then assume kind of the leading significant others into socialization. So we tend to then allow our friends to have a heavier influence on our thoughts and our values, our ideas. Okay, now family still stays important, but our peer groups tend to take over there. Now, as far as institutional agents, that's going to be school, your workplace, religion, government, state, and mass media. So school has a huge influence. We are taught from preschool on up what is acceptable, not acceptable, good, bad, right, or wrong. So it has a huge influence in teaching societal norms. Now, a functionalist, remember functional perspective of sociology is going to say that schools fulfill a function by socializing children into these appropriate or inappropriate or good or bad behaviors. such as you don't speak unless you raise your hand, and you don't interrupt people, or you walk quietly in the hallway so you don't disturb others. These are what are known as the hidden curriculum and the teaching of social norms in schools. Now, conflict theorists will suggest that schools reinforce inequality and divide based on teachers might praise boys more than girls for certain things. So our school teaches us proper behaviors, what is good, bad, right, or wrong. That is expected of us outside of school. Now, our workplace, we learn to behave appropriately within the workplace. Based on each given occupation, certain behavior is expected or certain behavior is frowned upon. So our workplace teaches us that. Usually we start learning that as a teenager when we start getting our first part-time job, and we learn what is good, these values, being on time, doing your work, going above and beyond, that sort of thing. Our religion also plays a part in socializing us by teaching us morally what is good, bad, right, or wrong. Our government, state-run agencies, of course, influence us, such as things such as it's illegal to drink until you're 21, you can't vote until you're 18, speed limits when you're 16, you have to stay within the speed limit. So our government influences our thoughts of right and wrong based upon the laws and regulations that we make. And then mass media or technology. Basically, television, what you listen to, what you watch can have both a negative and positive influence on us. The internet, cell phones, all of these technological advances influence us because it then allows us to be exposed to a broader, larger arena. So just understand these agents of socialization and how they influence us. The last thing that we're going to look at through socialization is socialization in our life course. Now, socialization isn't a one-time thing. We are always being socialized our entire life from birth until death. So we are being socialized as we enter into different stages in our life, and then we experience different things. This is socialization. So our lifespan, basically, they now are calling the life course. So your life course is the time since you are born until the time that you die, and what happens in between is known as your life course. And so socialization happens through that. Now, during our life course, we will celebrate rites of passages at different stages. And each rite of passage and what is celebrated differs from culture to culture. But basically, a rite of passage is when an individual moves from one stage in life to another stage in life, and some sort of ceremony or celebration will take place to symbolize this changing from one stage to another. Now, in our culture, we have various rites of passages, but for everybody, the first rite of passage is being born. Okay, but let's just look at the American culture. Think of the times in which we have big celebrations, or in which people then will perceive you or start to perceive you differently because now you've entered into this stage. So the second huge rite of passage tends to be the first birthday. Parents tend to throw huge, big first birthdays. Okay, the next rite of passage might occur in kindergarten. So now you're no longer a baby, you're going to school full time, and so we're going to celebrate going into kindergarten. Now keep in mind, with each of these stages, we now have a different expectations of behavior placed upon us because we're now in this. So we're now going to expect a kindergartner to act differently than a toddler. Okay, the next rite of passage most of the time for us is when we become a teenager. So when we turn 13. That tends to be a big rite of passage. Then the next might be 16, getting your driver's license. And then the next is going to typically be around 18 is when you graduate from high school. Some of us graduated when we're 17, so it's not, 17 or 18, but the next rite of passage is graduating high school. Also, at 18, you can vote. You can join the military. Those are all rites of passages. Now, what happens after 18 differs. The stages differ based upon life choices. So the next rite of passages may be that someone just goes straight to work, so they enter the workforce, or someone joins the military, or someone goes to college, someone gets married. Those are all rites of passages. Okay, the next rite of passage could be 21, of course. Now we're legal to drink, and then based off of that, again, if you chose to get married, then the next rite of passage might be becoming a parent. If you choose to work, then it might be that you get a promotion. If you chose to go to college, you're graduating college. Based off of that, the next big tends to be turning 30, especially for women. And then turning 50 is a rite of passage. If someone gets a divorce, that's a rite of passage. If someone loses a parent or a spouse, that's a rite of passage. The next common big rite of passage is basically when someone retires. That age, it used to be 65 being the rite of passage. Now retirement age is different. So when you retire, that's a different rite of passage. Becoming a grandparent is a rite of passage. And then our very last rite of passage, of course, is dying. So we're going to look at these different passages or stages of life and expect different things from different people. Now, during our socialization, we're going to have two terms I want you to know, which is anticipatory socialization and re-socialization. Anticipatory socialization refers to when a person rehearses for a role they are likely to assume in the future. So that's when a high school student might prepare themselves to get ready for college and how they're going to study in college. Or you might want to become a pro athlete, and so you start then assuming the behaviors and thoughts and ideas and acting the way pro athletes do. So anticipatory socialization is that a person is rehearsing or taking on aspects of a future role. Now, re-socialization, however, happens when you want a person to discard old behaviors and replace them with new behaviors. And re-socialization happens a lot of time in as a result of something negative. So this re-socialization is the whole idea of jail or prison, to re-socialize the individual to get rid of old behaviors and then take on new behaviors. It's also the purpose, re-socialization is the purpose of rehab or any type of psychological counseling. It's to get rid of the old and bring in something new. Now, military is the same way. Okay, now a lot of times prison and the military will do this through what is known as degradation ceremonies. So basically what they do is they strip away anything that is the identity of the old. So they strip that away and then they break you down to make you one of many. Okay, and then through that one of many, through that process, you get and then get socialized into a new identity. Now, prison will do this by no longer calling you by name most of the time. You're assigned a number. And then through programs in the prison, they hope to rehabilitate you and re-socialize you so that when you leave, you have kind of this new idea, this new concept of who you are. Military does it. They'll call you, but they'll call you by name, but then it might be some derogatory name that is given to you, and then as you come out, you develop this whole new concept of self and who you are. So really what I want you to know is, what is the terminology of life course? When does it begin? When does it end? What are rites of passages, and how each of these rites of passages influence us, and what is expected of us? And I want you to know the terms anticipatory socialization, re-socialization, and degradation ceremonies.